Hi everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Jen Bunty. I'm the Public Information Coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. We're also referred to by our acronym CAFMS. I'd like to introduce Charles LaFon. Charles is a professor at Texas A&M University, but before his time in Texas, he received a master's and a PhD from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He's been at Texas A&M since 2000, and his research focuses on forest disturbance and vegetation dynamics, specifically in Appalachian forests. The work he's presenting today is included in a GTR General Technical Report produced by the consortium in collaboration with the USDA Forest Service. Electronic copies of the GTR are available on the CAFM's website, www.appalachianfire.org. We'll also have a recording of this webinar available on the website. So if you have any colleagues that aren't able to attend but want to get the information.
Thank you, Jen. And just to confirm that you can hear me okay? Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, thanks. As Jen noted, I've been working on this issue of fire in the Appalachians for quite a while. I would trace my interest in fire in the Appalachian Mountains to growing up there in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, actually the southwest part of Virginia. My dad actually probably is the one who introduced me to an interest in fire. He tells of when he was growing up in the region, people setting fire to their fields back in the 1930s and 40s, and how the broom sage grasses would come in more thickly after the fire than they had been previously. He remembers that the woods were more open and there were blueberries in more abundance than we see today under the more crowded forest. In fact, when we were kids in the 1970s and 80s, he would burn little patches around our house, nothing on the scale of the acreages that most of you fire managers who are listening to this burn today, but you know, we're talking less than an acre, but he would burn. He had a recognition of fire as an important aspect of ecology. He wouldn't have put it that way, I suppose, but he recognized the importance of it. So he was doing prescribed burns in the Appalachians in the 1980s. So I would attribute most of my interest in fire to him. I would, before I continue here, also note the collaborators, the co-authors on this talk. Adam Naito earned his PhD from my department here at Texas A&M a couple of years ago, and I was able to hire him as a postdoc with support from CAFMS, and he helped to put together a lot of the data that we'll be looking at today. Henry Gracino Mayer and Sally Horn of the University of Tennessee are people I've collaborated with for a long time. In fact, Sally was my PhD advisor when I was back at the University of Tennessee. And then Tom Waldrop, most of you know, retired recently from the U.S. Forest Service. The origins of the material that I'll discuss today, the synthesis of fire history in the Appalachians, is linked closely to the consortium, to CAFMS. In fact, the proposal under which CAFMS was originally funded back in 2010 included a series of reports, synthesis reports, that would be developed for the Appalachian region to help communicate fire science to managers. One of those syntheses would be a synthesis of Appalachian fire history, and that's the one that we've developed here in support with support from the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. So let me just put in a plug here for CAFMS. It does great work and enables research and communication that couldn't be achieved otherwise. It's been a real treat to work with CAFMS over the years. And as Jen mentioned, the synthesis that I'm presenting here today is a synopsis of the larger report that was just published in paper form just last month. It's only been out a few weeks now, and as Jen noted, it's been online here for a few months. So I would encourage you to look at that for more details about the things that we'll be discussing here today. For that synthesis, we included work that Henry and Sally and I have done, but also work that others have done across the Appalachian region. What we sought to do was to bring together as much fire history information as we could lay our hands on to synthesize it to the extent possible at this time. And so the orange dots on there represent fire scar studies. The ones in the central part of the area there in Virginia and down into Tennessee and North Carolina are the ones that we've done, but there are others out in Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania that Mike Stambaugh and others have done. Ryan Ramakuen and others. So there's a lot of work here from various people that have gone into this synthesis report. The green squares and the yellow squares are charcoal studies, radiocarbon dated charcoal studies. And then the purple polygons are witness tree studies. While they're not directly about fire history, they concern vegetation, much of which was fire-dependent vegetation like oak and pine and its distribution on the landscapes in the past. Our study area for this synthesis is focused on roughly the CAFMS region, the area that's outlined there in various shades of purple, in which those dots and squares and polygons are imposed. So we included the Appalachian Plateau, the Ridge and Valley, and the Blue Ridge, but also the Piedmont, because there are some studies from the Piedmont that are relevant, a few studies that are relevant from the Piedmont. We wanted to include those as well in our synthesis study. So the synthesis report details a variety of types of information about fire history and the conclusions that can be derived from those. I want to encapsulate all those details in 3 main points. And the most important point I want to focus on today is that Appalachian vegetation was shaped by fire prior to the fire exclusion era. That's the biggest single take-home point from all the data that we've gathered. As all of you know, there is lots of vegetation in the Appalachian region that has fire-associated traits. The sprouting oaks, the serotinous cone pines. In this landscape that we're looking at here from atop Reddish Knob on the West Virginia border looking out toward the Shenandoah Valley, we see a landscape that's covered with oak with patches of Table Mountain pitch pine stands mixed in with it. In fact, one of our fire history sites is down there by the pond in the in the middle ground. So the vegetation itself gives clues that fire has a long history on this landscape, else those adaptations wouldn't be present. But within the vegetation itself, there are additional clues that provide direct evidence of fire, and one of those, a very convenient type of evidence that's preserved on trees, is fire scars that are embedded in the rings. And so here's Henry Gracino Mayer sawing a cross section from a fire-scarred pine snag on Brush Mountain in Virginia. And once those snags are cut, or cross section from those is cut, they can be taken back to the lab, sanded, and dated. By dating the tree rings, we can date the scars that are embedded in the wood. We can see where the scars formed and were healed over in multiple cases. Here we have 8 different fire scars on this single piece of wood. So that's our basic data on fire scars. Many of you have undoubtedly seen these fire charts before. I'll just run through an example here. This is the graphic view of the raw data. On the x-axis at the bottom is a timeline that dates, in this case, back to the mid to late 1600s and up through the entire 20th century. It's Reddish Knob site in Virginia, that site we were just looking at there. All of those horizontal lines are representations of individual trees, the time span covered by individual trees. So here we have 60 or 70 fire-scarred trees represented at different parts of that whole time period. And on each one of those trees you see vertical cross hatches. Those little vertical hatches are the fire scars. Those are the dated fire scars. At the bottom then we have a composite record of all the fire scars from all the trees at that site at George Washington National Forest. And from those we can put together the fire return interval for the site. The average here, average composite mean fire interval, the average for the fire intervals portrayed there along the bottom, along that timeline, was approximately 5 years for the Reddish Knob site. So the fire-scarred trees provide a good representation of the fire interval in the past. You'll also notice that during the 20th century, fires were rare at this site, but they were frequent all the way back to the 1600s before that. I should also note that there is some information from fire-scarred trees, their ages, and also from plot data that we collect about the intensity or the severity of fires. If you'll notice right there, in the late 1600s and early 1700s, there are a number of trees established at about the same time, a little cohort of those Table Mountain pine, pitch pine trees established there, which may suggest that one of the fires there in the late 1600s was a little more severe than most and opened up the stand and permitted a cohort of pines to establish. We see another one of those in the late 1800s. We see this more pronounced in some other sites. This is the Pisgah National Forest Linville Mountain site. We have a similar fire chronology here, but when you look at it, this is a 4-year fire return interval, so similar to Reddish Knob. But when you look at this one, we see some really distinct cohorts. There's one around the early 1700s, and right after that red line, you can see that a number of trees established. The early 1800s saw another period of establishment of those pine trees, and then finally in the early 1900s we saw another bit of cohort establishing as well. And so this seems to be a site where frequent surface fires were interspersed on occasion with more severe stand replacing or partially stand replacing fires. So we have some information here about the severity as well as the frequency from these fire scar trees. For our report, we synthesized data from 44 fire scar sites across the Appalachian region, represented by those orange dots. Many of those extend back to the 1800s, 1700s, or even the 1600s in a few cases. A few of them only extend back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. So we have a mix here of how long those records extend back into the past. But looking at all of them, the fire frequencies before the fire exclusion interval, there's a range of mean fire intervals. The shortest was 2 years for a site in the lower elevations of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in shortleaf pine oak stands. The longest was a 20-year mean fire interval in eastern West Virginia. The average across all the sites was 7 years. So the average mean fire interval across all that Appalachian region was 7 years. Fires occurred frequently before fire exclusion. I would note that the variations that you see here partly represent differences in climate and terrain and so forth, no doubt, but they also probably represent differences in the sample size. The more fire-scarred trees you obtain from a site, the more likely you are to pick up mild fires that might not have scarred many of the trees. And so, for example, the range in sample size is from 9 to 116 trees. That long fire return interval of 20 years in eastern West Virginia is the one with only 9 trees. It may be that site, because there were so few fire-scarred trees, that some of the fires were simply missed and that it actually had a more frequent fire return interval than is indicated. So that's a thing to bear in mind. These are only estimates. We don't have a certain record of all the fires that occurred at any of the sites. Even the one with 116 trees in the Smoky Mountains, there may be fire scars that didn't form from fires that just simply were not hot enough or for whatever reason didn't scar all the trees. So these are estimates of fire frequency at fire intervals across the Appalachian region. Fires occur frequently. With the focus on mean fire interval, I don't want to ignore the fact that there is some variability, and that variability in fire return interval likely had important ecological implications. The x-axis here shows the interval. This is for the Reddish Knob site in Virginia, for example, but we could calculate these for any site. The interval in years for the fire intervals that we collected at that site. So in other words, most of the fire intervals for the Reddish Knob site were short, just a few years, but a few of the intervals were longer. And so we have a histogram here. That's what the gray bars represent, a histogram of fire intervals in the past. The blue line represents a modeled probability, and that would show up on the y-axis, a model probability of fire intervals for this site. And so from that modeled fire probability, we can calculate the length of the probability of any particular interval. So, for example, down at the bottom, if we're looking at the probability of a 10-year interval, for example, it looks as if every third interval, about 32% of all the fire intervals, were greater than 10 years. Even though the mean was shorter than that, many of the fire intervals were longer than 10 years. And so that might be important, so, for example, for oaks, which need a period of fire-free intervals for them to a little longer fire-free interval for the seedling to grow up to be large enough to resist the next fires that occur. So periodic intervals of a little bit longer length may have been important ecologically for oaks and pines and many other species. If, on the other hand, you're looking at an interval of 40 years, maybe there's a species, hemlock or something, that needs a really long interval before it can grow large enough to withstand subsequent fires, a 40-year interval just didn't occur in the past. I mean, the probability of that was so low that it almost was non-existent under the historic fire regime. So that variability in fire interval is an important one to consider as we mostly focus on mean fire intervals. Here's another way of looking at changes in variability in fire frequency through the SCAR record. These are 3 sites that one of my students studied in the George Washington National Forest in Virginia. On the x-axis is the decade, and so what we've done is calculate a decadal fire interval, fire index we've called it. That's just an index of fire frequency, and so a higher value represents more frequent fires, lower value indicates less frequent burning through that decade. And so what we see going back to the 1600s and up through the end of the 20th century is that in the pre-exclusion era, fire varied from decade to decade, but it stayed roughly the same over the long term. So though there were variations from decade to decade, there was no long-term increase or decrease. Fires occurred frequently on the pre-European settlement landscape. They occurred frequently under European settlement. They occurred frequently while there was logging and mining on the landscapes. They occurred at about the same interval all through those different land use phases. The big change, of course, came in the early 20th century with fire suppression and protection efforts, and so we end up with a rapid decline in fire interval during the 20th century. So that's about the length of record that fire-scarred trees can give us. Before the 17th century, we haven't found any fire-scarred trees. We run up against tree lifespans and decay and so forth. And so to get an understanding of fire history prior to the record that's established by fire-scarred trees requires another proxy in addition to fire-scarred trees, and that would be charcoal. This is a picture of Sally Horn and some students on a raft in a lake in East Tennessee, coring the sediments in the bottom of the pond. In that sediment in the bottom of a pond or a bog is captured charcoal and pollen from the surrounding landscape, and the charcoal in those cores, here's a picture of a core being extruded here, the charcoal that's within there can be dated, and in a bog there's a sedimentary record with stratigraphic control that provides an opportunity to date the changes in fire history over time, or at least the input of charcoal fragments into the lake. And that gives us some information about past fire history. It doesn't tell us the intervals like fire-scarred trees can, so it lacks the temporal resolution. We can't get year-to-year variations or decade-to-decade variations probably in fire frequency, but we can look at the long-term, multi-century, multi-millennia even record of fire history in a particular place. And so the green squares here show where those sites have been conducted, where those kinds of studies have been conducted at sites in the Appalachian region. They vary in quality. One thing, unfortunately, about the Appalachian region is that it doesn't have very many natural lakes and bogs of any size. And in particular, even where there are lakes and ponds and bogs, they mostly have a very slow sedimentation rate. And so the slower the sedimentation rate, the less temporal resolution there is. There's just not much input. And so one little, one 10 centimeter increment or so of sediment wouldn't really represent a long time, and so it would be hard to differentiate short-term, decade-to-decade variations in fire interval, that kind of thing. But a few of those ponds have better, higher resolution records. So the quality varies. I'll show you an example of a couple of these. This is one that seems to be of fairly high quality. Trout Pond, West Virginia, right next to the Virginia border. We have almost a 1,000-year record of fire at this site. This is a study by Lynch and Clark, conducted for the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest. We created graphs like this that standardize this is from our synthesis report. We created a graph that based on data that we obtained from Lynch and Clark's report to put all the charcoal data in a common format that makes sense. And so on the x-axis we just have the timeline, on the y-axis we have the charcoal accumulation rate, and so you can see some variations over time. It looks as if there's a base level of charcoal accumulation throughout that 1,000-year period that could be interpreted to represent frequent surface fires of the kind that was documented by our fire-scarred trees. We have occasional pulses of more rapid charcoal influx, which may represent more severe fires, again similar to perhaps what our fire-scarred trees show. It could also just represent big erosion events in which mass wasting, debris flows deposited a lot of charcoal in the pond during that time. We can't know for sure what those big pulses represent, but what we clearly have here, and in various other studies from the region, is records of the last millennium having quite a bit of fire. For longer-term records, we have even lower resolution studies. This is one by the Delcourts, and so many of you are familiar with the Delcourts work. This is from Cliff Palace Pond in Kentucky. They have, we've graphed here the black bars indicating charcoal accumulation, and the brown and yellow, green, and purple lines represent pollen of different tree genera. But we can see a record of charcoal having been present at varying levels throughout the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, and changes in oak and pine as fire frequency changed over time as well. So we have a record here from the charcoal record of fire having been part of Appalachian landscapes for not just the last few centuries as shown by fire-scarred trees, but also for millennia before that as well. There's another form in which we can obtain soil charcoal, from which we can obtain charcoal, and it's from the soil itself, not from bogs or ponds. And those are the yellow squares represented there. Most of those have been conducted by Sally Horn and her students, Justin Hart and Chris Underwood, also one by Fez and Maren Christensen over in southwestern North Carolina. So only a few of those have been conducted. Here's a picture of Sally Horn coring the soil. And so there's no stratigraphic control here, no assumptions can be made about the charcoal fragments at the top being younger than the charcoal fragments at the bottom because the soil is churned and turned over and everything. And so this requires dates for many different charcoal fragments. But when we look, for example, here's a picture of a close-up view of one of those soil cores with charcoal chunks visible in it. When those chunks are dated, as Chris Underwood did for this site in the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, we again have a record of charcoal indicating fires were present here for the last 10,000 years. So the Holocene was characterized by fire. What we can't say about these, what can't be concluded, you can't make anything out of the apparent upward trend in charcoal over the course of the record. It's likely that charcoal has broken down over time in the past and has been transported off the site by erosion. And so for all the studies that have been done, it appears that charcoal increases. There's more young charcoal than old charcoal, and it may reflect something about fire history. It may also, and very likely, reflect only the vagaries of charcoal retention on the landscape. So based on the fire scar record and the charcoal record, we can conclude that Appalachian vegetation was shaped by fire prior to the fire exclusion era. That's the first point. The second point I want to make is that fires were especially common and extensive on oak and pine dominated landscapes of the Ridge and Valley Province and the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is a picture from the Blue Ridge. The Blue Ridge Mountains and the Ridge and Valley are, of course, the places where the greatest concentrations of public lands are located. They're the places where most of the fire history studies have been conducted, probably because that's where the federal lands are and that's where the managers are who want to see these kinds of studies conducted. Extending on up into Pennsylvania, there are state game lands, of course, in these regions. So there's lots of public land in the Ridge and Valley and the Blue Ridge. We see less public lands in the Plateau and especially on the Piedmont. The Blue Ridge and Valley are largely covered by pine and oak, which are generally considered to be fire-adapted species. So these landscapes have been studied quite a bit, and we can safely say that fire was an important part of these landscapes. We wanted to look at geographic variations to the extent possible between, say, the Ridge and Valley and the Blue Ridge versus the Appalachian Plateau. There are no fire history studies on the Piedmont to permit us to say anything about the Piedmont. The sizes of the circles here represent fire frequency, and so the larger the circle indicates shorter fire intervals, or in other words, more frequent fires. And the smaller circles represent less frequent fires. And so there does appear to be here a geographic trend where the Ridge and Valley and the Blue Ridge, and also the western parts of the Plateau, perhaps had more frequent fire than the Appalachian Plateau, at least the eastern edge of the Appalachian Plateau, which is fairly cool and moist, and therefore might be expected to have less frequent fire than the Ridge and Valley, which is in the rain shadow of the Appalachian Plateau. Nonetheless, fire was frequent across all those landscapes. The longest interval we had was 20 years over in the Plateau. So even on the Plateau, we have a record of fairly frequent fire in some of those places where it's been studied. Excuse me. To obtain those frequent fire intervals required fire to spread widely over the landscapes. The oaks and pines shed leaves, foliage that was conducive to the spread of fire over the landscape. These are flammable kinds of ecosystems when dried, and so they provide opportunities for fire to spread quite widely over the landscapes. For fire to have occurred so frequently at 4 or 5 year intervals at a point must mean that they spread from whatever points they were ignited to cover much of the landscape. And with large fires burning across the landscape, you can envision quite readily that fires would burn most points in the landscape at a fairly short interval. It's worth clarifying here some claims that fires were only restricted to narrow ridgetop pine oak stands. It has been said or thought by some authors in recent years that fires may have been limited only to narrow ridgetop oak pine stands in the Appalachians, and that the rest of the landscapes were covered with mesophytic forest. That isn't the case. Fires were widespread on the Appalachian landscapes. Oak and pine are the predominant cover over especially the Ridge and Valley and the Blue Ridge Mountains. The national forests and the national parks that you all are managing are mostly covered with oak and pine. Yes, there are mesophytic forests in the valleys and along the coves, but the predominant slopes are covered with oak and pine, and fires burn readily through those stands. For example, this is a picture of Brush Mountain in Virginia on the Jefferson National Forest. If you look, this is the north side of the mountain, so we're looking toward the south. The north side of that slope is corrugated into spurs, and on the west sides of each one of those spurs is a Table Mountain pine, pitch pine stand, showing up here as a darker color stand surrounded by the lighter green of the deciduous forest. The deciduous forests are mostly oak. This is one of the areas that we study for fire history, and at all of those sites that Henry and I and our students have studied, we sampled fire-scarred trees from multiple stands, usually 4 stands next to each other like this, and on many of those, many of the fires, individual fires, were recorded across all the stands in the same year. So in other words, the fire burned not only the pine stands, but the intervening hardwoods as well, which is what we'd expect. We see fires behave like that today. Notice that those pine stands are not growing on ridges, they're growing on the fairly dry west-facing slopes. They're down on the side slope of the mountain, not on the ridgetop. Pines and oaks cover the landscape. Fires burned through the pines, through the oaks, and covered extensive areas of the landscape in the past. So fires were especially common and extensive on oak and pine dominated landscapes, the Ridge and Valley and the Blue Ridge Mountains. We need more information about the Piedmont. We need more information about the Appalachian Plateau. We need fire scar studies from those areas. But what we can conclusively say is that in those Ridge and Valley and Blue Ridge Mountain areas, the places where large areas of public lands are located, fires burned extensively in the past. And then finally, this is no surprise, under fire exclusion, mesophytic tree species have expanded into paragenic vegetation, fire-formed vegetation, with discussions by Abrams and Nowacki, for example, of mesophication and so forth. This is what we expect to see. Some of the best evidence for the changes in vegetation that have occurred under changing fire regimes is work done on the basis of tree ring dating of tree establishment dates, especially when those tree establishment dates are paired on the landscape with fire history studies. And so what I want to show you here is some work that Will Flatley on the right, one of my PhD students, has done in the past from one of his sites. We, in the synthesis report, describe more studies, but this one is especially clear. This is the Log Watershed, this Log branch that we're looking at in the topographic map there. The little triangles on the watershed indicate fire-scarred trees that we sampled, 116 of those in all. The different colored polygons on the map represent the different forest types, the main forest types. The whites are the cove hardwood and hemlock forests growing along the streams and in the coves and north slopes. The light greens at the foot of the slopes are a white pine oak mix that you see in the lower slopes. The browns that cover most of the landscape, those are the oak hickory forest, especially dominated by chestnut oak. And then the dark greens are the yellow pine, the montane Table Mountain pine, pitch pine stands that we see at these middle elevation sites in the Smoky Mountains. The squares that you see on there, labeled with P's and C's and so forth, those are plots that we established on this unlogged watershed. This is a watershed that was not logged, so we can look at the age structure of the different tree species in a situation where they had not been subjected to logging. And so we can look more clearly at the signature of a fire without regard to having the influence of logging on this site. And so at each one of those little squares, we establish a plot across the topographic moisture gradient, from the pine stands through the chestnut oak stands, down into the white pine oak stands at the base of the slopes, and into the cove. The W's there, the red squares of W's indicate the cove on the west side of the Lick Log Branch, and the purple represents the purple E's represent the plots established along the cove bottom on the east side of that branch, which seem to work as a fire break. But I want to focus just on, I can't cover all of that study in the context of this talk, but I want to focus just on one set of those plots, the chestnut oak plot, since there's a lot of interest in fire and oak and the role of fire in oak regeneration and in protecting oak stands from the encroachment of mesophytic species. Here's a summary of our results. On the x-axis, we have the decades. So we dated the trees that record into the decade of establishment, and we have trees dating back to the 1690s there. And on the y-axis is the number of individuals of each species that were recruited in that decade. And so we have a histogram then, an age structure histogram for the oak forest. And so what we see clearly is that the browns there indicate the oaks that are existing out there on the landscape today. They established throughout the 1600s, 1700s, 800s, 1800s, and up into the early 1900s. There are a few pines there that established here and there. And then the others, the purple bars, represent everything from hemlocks to hickory. So there's a whole mix of different regeneration strategies and resistances to fire and everything in there. But our real interest here was on portraying oak and pine versus all the other species that might occur out there. There's clearly a change. There's clearly a change in the decade 1910 to 1920. That happens to be, as you might guess, the decade in which the last major fire occurred. Frequent burning really seemed to have thwarted the ability of all those other tree species to establish. Oaks regenerated throughout the period of frequent burning, as we might expect. Not in great abundance. It was undoubtedly, many of those seedlings were killed by fire, many of the saplings and even older trees were killed by fire, but some of the oaks survived throughout that period of frequent burning. But the other species did not. Today, that watershed is covered with many different things. The oak stands in there are covered with many different species. So in the past, those little oak seedlings could get established, and some of those could grow up to maturity under frequent fire. But today, the oak stand is choked in the understory with red maples and black gums and magnolias and even hemlocks that have expanded from the coves up into the upper slopes of the watershed into the oak stands. So the change in fire regime clearly had an impact on the vegetation of that watershed. So that's the last point I want to make then as a summary. Under fire exclusion, mesophytic tree species have expanded into pyrogenic vegetation. Those are my 3 points. There are many more details in the GTR report, and I hope that you'll take time to look through some of those. I would conclude with this photograph. This is from the Mill Creek and Fenwick Mines prescribed burns in the Jefferson National Forest in Virginia. It's a place that Steve Croy took us to when we had the CAFM's Fire History Workshop in Virginia back in 2015. This is a site that the U.S. Forest Service has been burning multiple times for the last 15 years or so. And I take you here because the studies synthesized here they're all research about fire history in the past and how it's affected vegetation. It's not my job, of course, to tell you how you should manage or what frequencies you should burn, but what I would note from the studies that we've compiled is that there is support here for your prescribed burning programs. There clearly was a lot of fire on the landscape in the past, and so you're well justified in conducting prescribed burns. And the fire SCAR reports with data about the frequency of fires, I think can provide you some guidance that you can use in implementing prescribed burns, what kind of intervals you might want to burn at, how much variation you might want to allow in your burns, with regard to variable fire intervals as opposed to just sticking around the mean fire interval, those kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of information here that's interesting from a research standpoint, but it also
Thanks,
can
Charles.
benefit managers as you go about conducting prescribed burns to restore fire-dependent vegetation. I'll stop it there, and I'll thank you for this opportunity to present to you, and I'll be willing to take questions.
While people are thinking through carefully wording their questions. Charles, what do you see the future is for this research?
Well, there are lots of directions I think we need to go. Putting the GTR together permitted us to really glimpse where we are, and it provides lots of confidence that fire was important across these landscapes. There's no doubt about that. The kinds of things that need to be done are, with fire-scarred trees, for example, filling in some of those gaps, that are not as well represented. Places like the Piedmont, and the problems we have on the Piedmont are that it's been so heavily used by humans that there might be very few old fire-scarred trees still out there on the landscape. Even in the mountains, we had to search long and hard to find places that had not been so heavily degraded by logging that all the fire-scarred trees had been logged out, and cut away. The Appalachian Plateau may have some of the similar problems, although I think there are more potential there for old fire-scarred trees to exist. There's clearly need for lots of this type of sediment and soil charcoal analyses. That really is not as mature as the fire scar network is. Even though we have quite a few points on that map, we need more charcoal studies, for example. So there are many directions this can go. In addition, there's need to understand more about fire and climate and fire and weather. I've done a little bit of work on that, and in fact, the first chapter of that fire the fire history GTR has kind of the background setting of fire regimes and what we know about fire behavior and fire climate relationships and so forth today. I think there's more study that needs to be done in those areas to understand the fire hazard today, as well as to put into context how fires might have behaved in the past under climatic variations like droughts and so forth in the past. So there are many directions that I think need to be gone here. Yeah, so that's good. That's a nice follow-up. Clearly, the best information we have about that is from the fires that occur today. And Henry and I did an analysis of that back about 10 years ago when we were in the middle of the fire scar research. We looked at the records from eastern West Virginia, and those two areas, the National Forest and the Shenandoah National Park up in that area. Then Will Flatley, my PhD student, looked at some of that for the Smokies and comparing the Smokies and Shenandoah. And then Barden and Woods back in the 70s looked at some of the data from the Southern Blue Ridge, Cherokee, and Nantahala and Pisgah National Forest. And all those studies seem to show that lightning ignitions occur most commonly in the late spring, a little bit after the peak of anthropogenic fires. There's some overlap, though. So the anthropogenic fires occur more in, say, March and April and start petering out in May, but the lightning ignitions, based on the data that we have, probably peak in May or June. I can't remember exactly when it was, when there's still probably some dry fuels and still some days that are not so humid, and some of those old snags that are struck by lightning are still dry from the winter and everything, but after the lightning season really starts to kick into gear. So I think that's when most of them occur. There are some lightning ignitions all through the summer and into the fall, but that spring, the late spring, early summer period seems to be the peak for that. What they did in the past, who knows? We can't distinguish from the charcoal or from the fire-scarred trees what was a lightning ignition and what wasn't. And so we don't know, but we have to assume that to some extent the climates were similar enough in the past that lightning ignitions were occurring at about the same time of year as they do now. I clearly think this is something that needs more work. I had a master's student who completed his master's thesis project last year for the grandfather district of the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, looking at the synoptic climatology of lightning ignitions up there, and most of those again occur in the late spring, early summer. And he was looking at the synoptic setting, so the broad scale circulation patterns of upper level jet stream and frontal boundaries and those kinds of things. And And we see some patterns there. We need more study of that sort, but in general, some of those occurred during high pressure situations when there was mostly dry weather and occasional events popping up along the Blue Ridge front. And then we had others that were following dry cold fronts. As the cold front went through, it would kick up storms. So more of that kind of work needs to be done to understand exactly how lightning ignitions cause fires and probably caused them in the past. I would note with regard to the fire-scarred trees, we can make some inferences about lightning versus human ignitions, but not a whole lot. We can look at seasonality. So the position of the scar within the ring. Most of those scars occur when the ring is in the dormant position. In other words, the tree was not growing. So it occurred during the fall or the spring, either after the tree had shut down its ring growth for that year or before it started for the next year. So we call those dormant. Most of the scars are dormant season burns. That corresponds with our spring-fall burn seasons that we see today. Some occur in the summer, but not that many. Some in the early growing season. The early growing season period could be lightning or anthropogenic. It's hard to know. When we look at fire frequency with respect to changes in land use, and especially that early period in the late 1600s, early 1700s, there were not many people in the landscape then. It had been the Native American populations had been decimated by disease and contact with the Europeans, and really ahead of European settlement, there was a period of depopulation in there in which there were not as many American Indians on the landscape as there would have been previously. And even in those low population levels of humans, there were still fires, either ignited by sparse human ignitions or by lightning, or probably a combination of the two. And so we have nothing that indicates a whole lot about lightning ignitions in the fire scar record. Our best inferences are probably from the contemporary fires that we see ignited today. We could exclude that. It doesn't really make much difference because for the long fire records that extend well back before that, we don't see any change. So let me go back to that section. So when we look at these records here, most of those in Virginia and Tennessee, North Carolina, are studies that Henry and I have, and our students have done. They're all studies that we've done. Those are all long fire scar records. We beat through the shrubs and everything until we found old fire scarred trees, and we're able to date those back to the 1700s at least, into the 1600s. The Bros and others up in Pennsylvania, also very old. The Shumway et al. Study, those are old. Most of those out in Kentucky and Ohio are short, and so we could leave those out, right? I mean, those only include fires from the late 1800s and early 1900s during that period you're talking about there. And so maybe I would say we really don't know as much about fire history in that region, because it may be that fires were less common before the logging boom there. When we look at the eastern Appalachian Plateau, McEwen and others, that's an old one that goes back to, I think, the 1600s with oaks, actually, fire-scarred oaks. I think the Hessel and others and Schuler McLean, those are fairly short. So on the plateau, we have some that are shorter, but also some that are longer as well. So it may be that we shouldn't use. We have to be cautious about using the period of the late 1800s, early 1900s, if we don't have older records from the same study site. So I think that would pertain primarily to the Kentucky and Ohio sites, excluding McEwen, which is an old one. But if we go up to these, those are the three in the George Washington National Forest. And so when we look at the fire intervals there, around that logging boom, there was nothing. There was no peak or anything, as we actually had expected to find. We thought there would be a peak there, but there seems to be no substantial difference in the level of burning during that period as opposed to what came before it. And so it's, for these sites, it seems reasonable to include the entire record in calculating the fire intervals. I would add that probably some of the fires that occurred during that logging boom might have been
Another minute here.
unusually severe because there was all the logging slash lying on the ground and that sort of thing, but the interval itself seems to not have been anomalous compared to what had come before.
All right, we have a question from Brandon. It says, based on directly observed results of prescribed burns in young shortleaf oak stands, less than 10 years, frequent low-intensity fires often do not leave fire scars. Based on the results presented, we can assume the mean intervals represent the minimums. All right.
That's correct. That's a very good point. And so we may be missing lots of fires. We know that fires occurred at least as frequently as we've documented here. Very good chance they occurred more frequently than that. And that's really the reason we collect as many trees as we can from a site. There are lots of locations that we scouted out originally before settling on these where we'd find one or two trees that look like they had, they're really old snags or whatever that have a long record, but not enough of those to put together a reliable fire history record. And so the more trees we can sample, the better chance we have of capturing those. But even then, odds are we're missing some of the fires. So yes, you're correct. These are minima. And the whole issue of scar formation is an interesting one that deserves more study. And you asked Jen about future directions. That's one that we've discussed using some of those prescribed burn areas to look at which trees scar and which ones don't. It's often the case that you find large old pine trees out there that don't have any fire scars at all, beside trees that do. And so some of those trees apparently reached an age. They escaped fire for long enough when they were small not to be scarred, and when they were young, and they never were able to be scarred after that because as the bark thickened and so forth, they were not scarred. And yeah, so that's a very interesting question with multiple dimensions to it. Oh, that's a good question. I just had a master student, Matt Vaughan, who was interested in that question. He's since graduated, and he's going to be working at Clemson this year. So you'll be seeing him around there, Jen, if you haven't met him already. And I know there are a few other people who have looked at chestnut as well. I don't think we know enough to be certain about any aspect of chestnut and fire. It seems that it has some traits that are kind of similar to oak. It sprouts and has fairly thick bark, but on the other hand, it may have more competitive characteristics, more rapid growth, and thrive without fire more readily than oak can. My guess is that it really did capitalize on canopy gaps in the way that something like yellow poplar can, but also was able to thrive under frequent burning. I don't think it. The roots are not the roots are not quite as well adapted to fire. There's not as much underground and large roots and underground bud and everything you don't have really the hypogeal situation that you do with oaks. And so I think the ecology of the chestnut might not be quite as amenable to fire. And so on sites with severe fires, it might not have done as well. That said, though, we find chestnut sprouts in those Table Mountain pine, pitch pine stands. So clearly they did grow there in places where fire burned frequently and at least occasionally with fairly high severity. So chestnut was an amazing tree that seemed to be able to withstand a variety of conditions. So I waffled a little bit there. I think I'm waffling because I don't know, and I don't know that anyone knows quite for sure exactly how fire and chestnut go together. Yeah, good. Well, I think he's working on another project there that's already a funded project, and I guess fire surrogate or on prescribed burns. So I don't know that chestnut will be part of that. Maybe it will. Maybe it could be. I know that he's interested in chestnut and would like to continue pursuing that. But I think there's work to be done with chestnut and fire, and that's getting answers to those would be very good. I think with the research that has been done to date on fire history, it's hard to get at the chestnut problem. I mean, partly because they're not there. We can't core chestnut trees and find out what they did and how they responded to changing fire regimes. One thing I should mention that there may be some possibilities there with with the soil charcoal, not the sediment charcoal, but the soil charcoal that Chris Underwood and Justin Hart and USALI students have worked on in the past. The soil, Chris Underwood for his dissertation was able to identify the species, or at least the genus, of the charcoal, because these are large charcoal fragments. They're not little tiny pieces like you would find in a sediment core from a bog. These are large chunks in many cases, and he could identify the species. And so if enough of those were dated and identified to species, it may be possible to look at something about the role of fire in chestnut. And of course, with the sediment charcoal studies from bogs, we do see, well, let's see if we look at for example, the Delcourt study. We have pollen, and there does seem to be, if you look down on the bottom right of this graph, the tan line indicating chestnut. So chestnut rose there as fire rose, also associated with anthropogenic burning there in that part of Kentucky. And then you see, of course, the chestnut declined there in the 20th century. And so maybe there's an association with fire, although when you look further back in time, there was a lot of fire and not so much chestnut. So again, it's a little bit ambiguous as to how chestnut responded, and that early fire regime may have been different, maybe more severe fires than was the case later on in the last 3,000 years or so. So I expect the fire severity as well as the fire frequency would have to be taken into account in dealing with chestnut, maybe more so than in the case of oak and pine, which are more readily adapted to more severe fires.
Questions coming in. Is there anything else you'd like
But
to
good question. I mean, it's an important one, and it deserves more study. It's just a little bit slippery. No, I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this. This is essentially the same talk with a little bit more detail than I was able to give at the Southern Blue Ridge Fire Learning Network last month. I had a little bit less time there, so I could only include a little bit of detail so I was able to include more detail today, and I thank you for the opportunity to do that and to present to everyone here. I hope that it's been useful to people, and I would definitely encourage you to look for the GTR. I should just express some gratitude to CAFMS and to Helen and the Southern Research Station Publication Shop for enabling us to produce a nice publication. I was very impressed with the quality of the images and everything they were able to put together. So Jen, you and Helen, I think, are able to mail out some of those hard copies for people who want those, and of course it's online as well.